horse charges through a snowstorm, its body torn and bleeding, trembling as it shields a newborn, abandoned on a cracked, frozen lake. No words, only breath, warm alive, defying death itself. This wasn't a miracle. It was the instinct of love beyond species, beyond humanity. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful, unpredictable stories, like this one. The wind had gone mute. It was the kind of silence that wasn't born from peace, but from something brewing deep unseen, like a beast crouched just beneath the snow-heavy pines of Willow Creek, Montana. The town lay sunken and white-swallowed whole by the blizzard that had passed the night before. No cars moved. No plows rumbled. No voices pierced the brittle air. Just endless white pressed against old wooden houses like a held breath. On the far edge of town, tucked beneath the shadow of a pine-covered ridge, sat a cabin that didn't belong to the present. Time had given up on it. Shutters hung like tired eyelids, and the porch creaked when no one moved. In that cabin lived 17-year-old Savannah Jameson. She was a quiet girl. Not the kind of quiet that asked for attention. The kind of quiet that made people forget you were in the room. Savannah had lived alone here since her parents died 2 winters ago. Carbon monoxide, they said. She didn't talk about it. Instead, she drew. Sketchbooks filled the floor, the walls, sometimes the ceiling when she couldn't sleep. Horses, mountains, foxes, and things too soft for the world outside. That morning, she wore 2 coats and a scarf her mother once wrapped around their old dog. The cold didn't bite anymore. It had moved in like a roommate. She pulled a wide wooden snow shovel from the shed and dragged it toward the edge of Stillwater Lake, a vast, frozen surface just past the tree line. The snow was waist-deep in places, and each step she took left behind the story of her presence in that blank world. The wind picked up gently as she neared the lake's ridge, whistling through birch branches the way a sleeping house moans in its bones. Savannah shoveled in silence. Her breath fogged and hung in the air like little ghosts. The blade of the shovel scraped against something hard. She paused, waited, listened. There it was, a sound, no an instinct first. A ripple in her spine. The kind of thing animals feel when an earthquake begins miles away. Then she heard it soft, fractured, nearly not there. A cry. Her head snapped up, eyes scanning the frozen void. Nothing moved, nothing lived. She stepped forward. The cry came again. Thin, wet, human. Panic lanced through her chest. She dropped the shovel and fell to her knees, clawing at the snow with gloved hands. Her nails bent backwards, bleeding under fleece, but she didn't stop. She dug like something sacred was buried there, and in a way it was. Her breath caught. Beneath the snow, a small crack in the ice blinked open, like a wounded eye. The cry came again, louder now, urgent. She scraped faster, her hand's raw face streaked with frost. The snow gave way, and there it was, a baby. A newborn boy wrapped in a hospital blanket, soaked through and already stiff at the edges. Skin mottled blue lips, purple eyes barely open. He was curled in a small crater where the snow had given just enough for breath, barely enough for life. But that wasn't the only thing. Behind him, around him, was a shape. She blinked. A horse. No, something more feral, more wild. A white Mustang coated in frost, its flank torn open just above the leg. Blood bright against all the white had frozen in thin lines across its side. It lay curled around the child, one leg kicked slightly back as though it had dragged itself across the ice just to reach him. The horse shivered violently. Its ribs moved with shallow desperation, muscles twitching as if the very effort to stay alive was being used to keep the child warm. Its one eye stared at her. A kind of plea passed between them. Savannah gasped. The sound tore out of her like a wound breaking open. There were no words. Her boots crunched as she stumbled forward, slipping on the ice, falling to her knees beside them. The baby muled skin barely clinging to warmth. She reached out with trembling hands. The horse shifted, instinctual protectiveness flaring, but it was too weak to rise. It only groaned, a sound full of animal pain and something else. Something almost human. Savannah pressed her hands to the child's body first. He was cold, but breathing. Still breathing. She whispered nothing. Just the rush of air from her lungs as she wrapped him into her chest, her jacket, her scarf, anything. The horse's breath rasped white fog pulsing against the ice. Savannah looked down at it. The way its body arched protectively. The way it had stayed when any other creature would have run from the cold, the pain, the end. "You're coming too," she said, barely more than a breath. Her voice cracked like dry wood. She stood baby against her chest and pulled her scarf tighter. Then she crouched again beside the horse. She tried to lift its front shoulder. It didn't budge. Her breath came faster. Her mind raced. No cell signal, no help, no time. She ran. Back through the trees, back to the shed. She yanked the sled and old wooden toboggan out into the clearing. rope canvas straps. Her fingers moved faster than her thoughts. When she returned, the baby was whimpering face against her heartbeat. The horse hadn't moved. Savannah laid the baby down on the sled, gently nested in a wool blanket. Then she turned back to the horse. It took everything she had. She looped the rope under its chest behind its front legs, gritting her teeth with every pull. Blood soaked into the snow where the wound on its leg reopened. It didn't cry out, only watched her with that eye dark, endless wide. She heaved. The sled creaked. The horse groaned. But it moved. Bit by bit, inch by inch, she dragged both the baby and the horse through the snow-laced woods. Her legs burned. Her breath tore at her throat. Every time she stumbled, the snow welcomed her like a grave. But she didn't stop, not when her knees buckled, not when blood from the horse began to soak her jeans, not when the baby stopped crying, only silence. Just her, the girl, and this burden of life, wrapped in fur and breath and frostbite. As she approached the cabin, she screamed. No words, just raw sound. A sound like something breaking open after years of being closed. A sound the wind had no choice but to carry. She yanked open the door, rushed the baby to the fireplace, lit with trembling hands the logs she had placed there 3 days before. The match shook in her fingers. Flame, light, heat. She stripped her coat, wrapped it around the baby, held him close, rocked on the floor. Then she went back out, into the wind, to the sled. The horse didn't move. Her body moved without thinking, hauling, lifting, begging. She dragged Glacier, she would call him that, later into the cabin, into the heat beside the fire next to the baby. Her arms shook. Her face was streaked with melted snowblood soot. She collapsed beside them, and for the first time since her parents died, Savannah Jameson cried, not out of fear, not even grief, but because something had been left in the snow that was never meant to survive. And somehow it had. Silence returned, but now it was sacred, not empty, not still. It was the sound of a storm that had passed and left something breathing behind. Somewhere outside, the sky cracked open and a single shaft of sunlight spilled over the lake, touching the place where life had once been buried. The fire was down to embers. The boy swaddled in Savannah's coat and 2 folded blankets slept in a wicker laundry basket that once held winter apples. His tiny chest rose in uncertain rhythms, like a bird not yet sure if it should fly or fall. The cabin groaned under the weight of the storm's silence. Wind pushed against the walls in heavy exhalations, searching for cracks for ways in. But inside, a different battle was underway. Savannah knelt beside the white horse Glacier, though she hadn't named him yet, and pressed a damp cloth to the gash on his leg. The wound had frozen slightly on the sled ride back, but now bled again, under heat. She worked slowly, gently whispering nonsense like a lullaby meant not for comfort, but for courage. "You're okay," she murmured. "You stayed. You stayed." His eyes blinked unfocused. He didn't thrash, didn't rear. He breathed shallow, but he breathed. She slid a bowl of warm water toward his mouth, but he didn't drink. His breath came out in white tufts, thin and barely visible now. Savannah shifted, stood shakily, and dragged 2 hay bales from the shed into the living room. She stacked them close to the fire and coaxed his body onto them with a mix of pushing, pulling, and pure silent pleading. The child whimpered. Savannah turned. The boy's stirred face, scrunched fists curled against his cheeks. His lips moved like he was mouthing something from a dream he couldn't understand. Then something happened. A movement. Subtle, simple. The horse's head tilted. It was almost imperceptible, but his nostrils flared, and from his mouth came a low, slow stream of breath. It reached the baby like a ribbon of steam in the dark. It passed over the child's cheek, and the boy sighed. Savannah didn't move, her eyes fixed on the strange communion before her, this injured beast, offering the only thing it had left. Its breath. Its warmth. Its instinct to guard what had no defense. The wind outside moaned again, not angry, just lonely. She looked at the horse's coat, white matted, streaked with blood and ash. The soft light of the fire bounced in his eyes, and for a moment she saw something impossible. Not just pain, purpose. She crouched beside him, one hand hovering over his mane, the other resting on her own heartbeat. "You're like ice that bleeds," she whispered. He blinked. She said it again. Glacier. And there it was. His name. Not just because of the color of him or the cold he carried, but because he'd moved like a glacier. Slow. Impossible. Forward even when the world cracked beneath him. "Your name is Glacier." She touched his neck. He didn't move. But the room felt warmer. The baby fell back asleep. Savannah pulled out her sketchbook from beneath the couch. Charcoal-stained fingers, already trembling with lines she hadn't drawn yet. She turned to a blank page, wiped the corner with her sleeve, and began sketching. The boy first, tiny, fragile, curled like a comma in a sentence not yet finished. Then Glacier, curved around him, hooves tucked, eyes open. She didn't speak, didn't narrate, but every stroke of the pencil, was a prayer. Outside, snow tapped at the windows. The world wanted in. But inside, something was being born. Later that night, long past midnight, Savannah sat curled beside the hearth, watching both lives breathe. Her memories usually buried beneath days of silence, and weather rose gently, like dust in warm light. She saw her father again, standing in the woods beside a wounded coyote. The animal's paw was caught in a barbed wire fence, bleeding. Her father never flinched. He whispered to it, moved slowly, wrapped its leg like it was human. She'd asked, "Won't it bite you?" And he'd said, "Even if it does, I'll know I didn't let it stay in pain." Another memory, her mother kneeling beside a fawn, hit by a snowmobile. "Everything tries to live," she whispered, tears streaking through soot. "Even when we've ruined their chances." Savannah leaned her head back now against the wall. Her throat ached. What would they think seeing her like this? Dragging a wild horse and a near-dead infant into their cabin. Lighting a fire, not just for heat, but for hope. Drawing instead of praying. Whispering instead of speaking. She closed her eyes, then opened them again, moved to her sketchbook. She flipped the page, drew a circle this time, inside the baby again. But this time he was reaching up. And Glacier was above him, lowering his muzzle, touching forehead to forehead. It wasn't accurate, it wasn't real, but it was what she'd seen. Not with her eyes, maybe, but with the part of herself that knew the difference between surviving and living. She titled it in the corner, "The Guardian." The fire crackled louder now. Glacier stirred. His ears flicked once, then again. He shifted just barely, turned his head toward the child's basket. His nostrils flared again. Savannah moved quickly, gently. She took the blanket from the back of the couch and draped it around both the horse's shoulder and the edge of the basket, creating a bridge, a tunnel, a place for warmth to pass. She didn't speak, just watched. The boy moved slightly. His hand reached out, brushed the air, touched the blanket, settled, and again silence. Not empty, not lonely, full. She leaned her head against the horse's side. The thrum of his heart beneath fur and hide sounded like a distant drum, a rhythm, a lullaby. She reached out for her father's journal on the shelf above the fireplace. Pages yellowed, corners soft with years. Inside, in his thick, uneven handwriting, she found the passage she remembered. "Don't ever let something go cold just because the world tells you it isn't yours. If your heart is warm enough, you can keep anything alive." She traced the sentence with her fingertip, looked back at them, this strange family forged in frost. The fire whispered, the wind bowed out. Morning would come, but for now she was the keeper of the heat, the girl who stayed, the girl who didn't look away. She would fight the ice, not with fire, but with presence. And when the world asked her later what she had done in that night of silence and snow, she would not speak. She would show them the drawing, the child, the horse, and say only one thing. They were never meant to survive alone. So I didn't let them. The first crack in the quiet came not from the storm, but from the world outside, finally noticing what had happened inside the cabin. It began with milk. Savannah had run out the second night. The baby needed more than what she could melt into formula from the old canister in the cupboard. He cried through dusk, small gasps turning to wails. Glacier flinched at the sound but didn't move. Savannah knew she couldn't leave them both, not even for an hour. So she called Mavis. They weren't exactly close. Mavis had known her parents more than her. But Savannah remembered how the woman held the hand of every dying thing, like it still had something left to say. Mavis arrived in a flurry of coat, gloves, and breathless concern. She stood in the doorway, blinking through the steam on her glasses, eyes falling first on the baby wrapped and sleeping in a wooden drawer turned cradle, and then on the horse. Glacier lifted his head weakly. Their eyes met. Mavis didn't scream, didn't ask questions. She simply exhaled and said, "I'm going to need a bigger bottle." The milk came later that day. And so did the questions. Mavis had told a friend at the clinic, quietly. Only that Savannah had a baby in her care and needed formula. No names, no locations. But Willow Creek was the kind of town where silence got dissected faster than sound. 2 days later, someone posted anonymously on a community forum. Girl living alone at the ridge. Baby, horse, found in snow, no parents. It exploded. Photos of the cabin from Google Maps were passed around. A blurry shot of Savannah from 3 years ago at a 4-H fair reappeared, captioned with cruel curiosity, the ice girl and her baby. By the time the local news station rolled up the dirt road in a mud-splattered van, Savannah knew it had already grown beyond her. The knock came sharp and rehearsed. 3 cameras, a microphone, 2 men in coats too clean for real winter. Mavis blocked the door. "She's not a sideshow," she said, arms crossed. "She's a kid." "Ma'am," the anchor smiled. "We're just doing a story on kindness, humanity. It's beautiful what she's done." Behind them, a drone buzzed up over the trees, filming, spinning, watching. Inside, Savannah rocked the baby, while Glacier stared through the window with a war-scarred eye that said everything she couldn't. Mavis slammed the door, but it was too late. The storm had come not of snow this time, but of people. By the next afternoon, 3 SUVs with tinted windows arrived. License plates from California, New York, even Arizona. 2 women and a man, all early 40s, dressed for money. Polite smiles, hands clasped as if in prayer. "We'd like to adopt him," one woman said. "We've been waiting for a sign. This baby, he's that sign." Another offered a check. 6 figures, blank space for the payee. Savannah didn't answer, didn't blink. Just looked down at the boy who now cooed when he heard Glacier's breath and curled against her chest like she'd been there since the womb. They left eventually, but not before taking photos. 2 days later, the story hit national news. Snow angel found in Montana, abandoned baby saved by wild horse and teenage girl. Savannah's name wasn't listed, but her face, blurry caught through frosted windows, was there. The baby's photo, too, despite laws meant to prevent that. The phones at the town sheriff's office rang non-stop. That's when Isaac came. He didn't knock. He stood on the porch, hand resting on the edge of his belt hat in the other. He waited until Savannah cracked the door just wide enough for one eye. "You remember me?" he asked. She nodded. "Your horse. He broke his leg last spring. You cried." He smirked just barely. "Yeah, that was embarrassing." They stood in the pause. Then he looked past her through the firelight. At Glacier. At the baby. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Just pushed the door open and stepped back. He came in slow, the way you do when walking through someone else's past. "People are coming," he said. "I know. They're not coming for him," he added. "Not really. They're coming for what he makes them feel." Savannah looked up. Isaac's face was tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from knowledge. From seeing things most people avoid. "I've been in law enforcement 6 years," he continued. "I've seen drug babies dumped at dumpsters, women chained to trailers. No one came running for them. But now you're a symbol." She glanced down at the boy, now sucking on a bottle, eyes flickering toward the fire. Isaac moved closer to Glacier. He saved the kid. Yes, stayed with him, covered him with his body. Isaac didn't speak for a while. Then, "Do you know what people will do to own that story?" "Not the truth, just the story." Savannah swallowed. Mavis arrived not long after. She came with a bag of medicine and soup, but mostly with fire in her voice. "They're calling from the city," she said, throwing her gloves down. "Saying you're unfit, saying you're a minor, that this is illegal." Savannah held the baby tighter. Mavis knelt beside her. "Listen to me," she said. "You didn't find him. You saved him. You bled for him. You gave him heat from a body that had no more to give. That matters." Savannah shook her head. "They'll take him. They might try. But honey, your heart doesn't need permission to love." Savannah blinked. Mavis cupped her cheek. "I lost my husband last year," she said, voice raw. "And for a while I thought love died with him. But I was wrong. Love stays. It stays in the hands we use to hold strangers. In the animals we refuse to let freeze. In babies we didn't birth, but were born to carry." A noise outside. Another car. Another knock. Isaac stood. "I'll handle it." He stepped out, voice firm. The door shut behind him. Savannah leaned against Mavis's shoulder. The baby stirred. Glacier's ear twitched. And somewhere beyond the glass, the wind began to howl again. Not cold, not cruel, but like a warning. A sound that said, "This will not be easy." But nothing sacred ever is. The air inside the church-turned-courthouse was thin like grief after it's been sitting too long in the same pews. It wasn't built for justice. Not really. The high wood beams still smelled of hymns. Crosses still hung crooked on the faded walls. The pulpit had been cleared for a judge's bench. The altar now cluttered with legal pads, coffee cups, and cameras. Outside, the snow had begun to melt under a pale sun. But inside, everything remained frozen. Savannah sat on the left side of the aisle, flanked by Mavis and a court-appointed lawyer who barely remembered her name. Her boots were muddy, her coat one size too big. In her lap, a sketchbook rested, not open yet, not closed either. Her hands didn't shake. But they didn't rest either. Across the room sat the Halberts, Walter and Teresa Halbert, founders of 3 compassion-based charities, owners of a chain of Christian bookstores in 2 states, and veterans of every televised adoption story that could be found on a feel-good segment. They were the ones who had filed for emergency custody of the infant found at Willow Creek. They had arrived in court with pressed suits, folded hands, and a legal team that cost more than the church itself. Teresa wore pearl earrings. Walter held a children's Bible on his knee. The judge, an older woman with bags under her eyes and a gavel she barely touched, called the hearing to order. "This is a preliminary custody hearing regarding the unnamed minor found on January 3rd, she said. Petitioners Walter and Teresa Halbert. Respondent Savannah Jameson, minor. No current guardian or known relation. The words bounced in Savannah's ears like hailstones. Cold, fast, pointless. Mavis leaned toward her. Remember what I told you? You don't owe them eloquence, just truth. Savannah didn't nod. She stared ahead. The Halbert's lawyer spoke first. Your Honor, we believe. The respondent, a 17-year-old girl living alone without any legal guardianship, is not equipped emotionally or financially to care for a newborn infant. Our clients are prepared to provide not only medical care and safety, but a stable, faith-based home. The judge raised one eyebrow. And how did you first learn of the child? From a public news story, Your Honor, which we believe constitutes a cry for communal responsibility. The word communal rang like a bad chord. Savannah's lawyer stood unsteady. My client didn't publicize anything, he said. She didn't seek fame. She acted on instinct. She saved this baby's life. And what proof do you offer that her care has been adequate? The opposing counsel snapped. Aside from the attention it's gathered, Savannah looked down. Her sketchbook was warm from her hands. The judge turned toward her. Miss Jameson, do you have anything you'd like to say for the record? Silence stretched. Mavis's hand found hers, but Savannah didn't squeeze back. Instead, she opened the book. She stood up quietly and walked forward. There were no words, just footsteps on old wood. Just her coat brushing against the edge of the pew. She reached the front, stopped, then opened the book wide on the table. Page 1. A drawing charcoal rough but sharp. The infant skin mottled, curled against the jagged split of ice. Page 2. A silhouette of Glacier. Bent, trembling, his body over the child, one eye wide watching. Page 3. Savannah. Her arms open, snow falling on her shoulders, eyes closed as if mid-scream. She flipped the page. Page 4. The boy asleep near the fire. Glacier breathing over him, their warmth forming a single fog. No one spoke. The room had gone full still. Only the camera clicks continued, hushed but constant. The judge squinted. Miss Jameson, are these original? Savannah nodded. A beat passed. Then another. Teresa Halbert leaned forward. With respect, Your Honor, drawings are not evidence. They're sentiment. But Isaac, standing at the back in full uniform, crossed his arms and said, they're truth, just not in your language. Everyone turned. He stepped forward. I've seen the cabin. I've seen the kid. I've seen the horse bleeding and still protecting something he could have left behind. She didn't just save a life. She stayed when no one else would have. Walter stood up, his voice smooth. Officer, I don't believe your testimony is relevant. You didn't find him? Isaac cut in. You found a story. She found a human. The judge rapped the gavel once softly. That's enough. But the weight had already shifted. Savannah stayed quiet. Her hands rested gently on the sketchbook, fingers curled as if guarding it from the world. Mavis stepped forward next. I've worked in palliative care for 22 years, she said. I've held the hands of dying children, watched families walk away from the things they created because they couldn't handle the truth. This girl didn't run. She didn't pass it off. She held him like he belonged, and he believed it. Objection, the lawyer called. This is not relevant testimony. Objection noted, the judge said, but her voice had changed. Softer now. She leaned back in her chair. Miss Jameson, she asked, do you understand what custody entails? The legal and medical responsibilities? Savannah nodded. Do you have a long-term plan? No answer, just the turn of another page. A drawing of Savannah, her hands over the child. But in the background, a field of horses. A future. Maybe imagined, maybe not. The judge let out a breath. This is only a preliminary hearing. Emergency custody will be determined pending investigation. But I see enough to delay permanent placement. I'm ordering child services to conduct a home evaluation within 72 hours. In the meantime, the child will be placed in neutral foster care. Savannah blinked. Once. Her fingers didn't move. She didn't cry. Not yet. But when the officer stepped forward to take the baby, still asleep, still warm, Glacier rose weakly from where he lay. The room gasped. His hooves thudded once. He stepped forward, one leg shaking, one breath heavy, and he placed himself between Savannah and the child, as if to say, not again. A pause, a silence. Then the officer backed up slow. Savannah stepped forward, lifted the baby, pressed a kiss to his forehead, and handed him over slowly with hands that felt like splinters. Only then, only when the baby left her arms did her throat shake, and a single tear fell onto the sketchbook below. Dark, quiet, permanent. It started with a name whispered too quickly. Mavis had been on the phone with a contact from social services, a friend who owed her a favor. They weren't supposed to say anything, but guilt talks louder than protocol when a baby's life is in limbo. The mother, the voice on the other end said, hesitant. She's 15, a girl from the church youth group. She refused to speak until they brought in her aunt. Then it came out. Who's the father? Mavis asked low. Silence. Then Pastor Caleb. The baby is his. Mavis didn't speak for a long time after that. She sat on the porch of Savannah's cabin, snow melting in quiet drops from the gutter above her. Glacier lay nearby, still healing, still watching his side rising and falling with stubborn breath. Savannah stepped out a moment later, carrying a warm towel for his leg. She saw Mavis's face tight as a knot that had just been yanked. "What is it?" she asked. Mavis hesitated. Then she said it. Savannah didn't flinch, didn't gasp. She sat beside Glacier, laid the towel down, and said quietly, "I knew it wasn't a miracle." Miracles don't start with trash bags and frozen lakes. The next morning, she walked into the church. Not the courthouse, where the judge had rendered her temporary defeat. The church. Her boots echoed off the cold tile. Dust hung in the shafts of light like memory. She didn't bring her sketchbook. Didn't bring Mavis or Isaac. Just her voice. And the weight of what she now knew. Pastor Caleb stood at the front, adjusting the microphone, speaking softly to two elderly women about Sunday's hymns. He looked different than the last time she saw him, his smile more cautious, his hands constantly moving. When he saw her, the blood drained from his face. "Savannah," he said, with the false warmth of a man already calculating the risk. "This isn't the place to discuss court matters. I'm not here for court." She walked slowly down the aisle. He glanced toward the back door, quick, nervous. She stopped halfway to the pulpit. "You lied," she said, voice soft, flat. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You're a child. You don't understand the weight of what you're implying." "I understand enough." He walked toward her, each step deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't reach for power. He reached for doctrine. "You don't understand the law of the Lord," he said. "There are consequences in this world. Some things must be buried. Not for ourselves, but for the flock. For the good of many." Savannah took a breath. The air was cold in her chest, but her lungs held steady. "I understand the heart of a mother," she whispered. "Even if she's young. Even if she's gone. I understand what it means to carry something inside you that no one wanted, and to watch the world try to erase it." Caleb's face twitched, just for a moment. Savannah stepped closer. "Why didn't you leave him at the hospital?" she asked. "Why the lake?" He didn't answer. "So she did. Because you didn't want a paper trail. Because even the system has eyes." Caleb's voice dropped into something colder. "You think you've uncovered a scandal, but you've exposed a wound that needed sealing. This town depends on order. I provide that." Savannah shook her head. "No, you depend on silence. That's different." He stepped forward, eyes flashing with something dark. "You think you can keep that boy? He's a sin made flesh." And yet Glacier didn't see it that way. She said, her breath forming steam between them. "A wild animal saw a baby and chose to protect it. You saw the same baby and chose to bury it." Caleb's mouth opened, closed. Savannah didn't wait. "You don't need to believe in me," she said. "But the world already believes in him. The world saw a story. I saw life. And you," she paused, "you saw a stain. You saw." She turned and walked out. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days. It bounced off the snow with sharp gold edges. The kind of light that made everything feel briefly holy. Isaac waited near his cruiser, arms crossed. "You did it?" he asked. "No," she said. "I said it." He nodded. "You want to ride back?" Savannah looked at the road stretching ahead. The wind had gone quiet. She shook her head. "I'll walk." She passed Glacier on the hill, grazing. He lifted his head as she walked by. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Some truths live outside of language. Some sunlight belongs to those who step through the shadow, even if their hands are still shaking. The verdict came on a Thursday morning, sharp and colorless. The courthouse smelled like old wood and damp paper. Savannah sat alone, spine straight, palms on her knees. She hadn't brought the sketchbook this time. She didn't need to. Her hands were already heavy with memory. Across from her sat the Halberts, again dressed in navy blue, coordinated like politicians in a family photo. Their lawyer smiled faintly, like someone about to win a chess match he'd known was his since the first move. The judge spoke plainly, as if reading a weather report. "Due to the respondent's age, lack of legal guardianship, and absence of formal foster certification, the court cannot grant custody to Miss Savannah Jameson at this time." At this time. Two words meant to soften the blade as it came down. The rest was noise, legalities, transfers, an appointed foster family from Billings. The boy would be moved today. Savannah didn't cry. She just stared ahead, blinking slowly, as if the whole room were underwater. Outside, the wind picked up. By the time she returned to the cabin, they were already there. A white SUV idled in the snow-packed driveway, its heat warping the air above it. A woman in a quilted jacket stood near the porch steps, clipboard in hand. She wore a smile like armor, friendly, firm, unmovable. Savannah stepped onto the porch. The woman turned. "Miss Jameson," she said, "I'm with Child Protective Services. We're here for the infant." No title, no name, just the infant. Inside, the boy was sleeping. The fire had gone to embers. Glacier lay beside him, eyes half closed, body curled around the cradle in instinctive resistance. "I need a moment," Savannah said. The woman hesitated, then nodded. Savannah stepped inside. She didn't speak, didn't whisper. She simply crouched beside the boy and traced his fingers with hers. He stirred, opened his eyes, and smiled. It was the first time she'd seen it, his smile. It didn't last. She lifted him, wrapped him tight, kissed the top of his head, and pressed her nose to his hair. Inhaled. He smelled like smoke and milk and the quiet of snow. When she opened the door, the CPS worker reached out. Glacier rose, slow, trembling. He stepped in front of the door. One hoof in the snow, head low, shoulders tensed. The woman froze. "I need you to move the animal," she said. Savannah shook her head. "He doesn't move for people. He moves for what's right." The second CPS agent, taller male, stepped around the SUV. He was carrying a leash. For what purpose, no one knew. He walked toward Glacier slow. The horse didn't move. "Back up," Savannah warned. But they didn't. The man raised his arm, then struck. A wooden baton, quick, sharp, cracked against Glacier's front leg. The sound echoed. Savannah screamed. The horse didn't make a noise. He staggered, dropped. Snow kicked up around him as his legs buckled. Blood darkened the white beneath him like spilled ink. He lay there, breath heavy, eye wide, not from fear. From something else. Loss. Savannah fell to her knees in the snow, baby still in her arms. The agent moved quickly now, took the child, wrapped him in another blanket, and turned away. The boy cried out short, broken. A sound that knew too much for its age. Savannah didn't move. Her hands were empty, her face white. The SUV door slammed. The engine growled. Snow crunched beneath the tires as it reversed. Glacier lifted his head. Watched the car go. He tried to stand again. Couldn't. Savannah reached out and pressed her forehead to his. The world went quiet. No yelling, no pleading. Only wind, brutal, rhythmic slamming against the cabin windows like waves on rock. The CPS agents left without another word. No one looked back. Mavis arrived an hour later. She found Savannah in the snow, still kneeling, arms hanging useless at her sides. Her lips were blue, her eyes open but vacant. Glacier lay beside her, breathing shallow. Mavis touched her shoulder, but Savannah didn't move. Because when something's taken like that, with the cold precision of legal language and the violent shake of a baton, it doesn't leave a scar. It leaves an echo. And it doesn't scream. It rings forever, like silence so loud it drowns. 3 days passed. Savannah hadn't spoken. Not to Mavis, not to Isaac, not even to Glacier. She stayed in her room, lights off, curtains drawn. The fireplace downstairs had burned to nothing, and the chill moved in like grief, slow, constant, familiar. Mavis brought soup, left it at the door, unopened, water untouched. The girl who once defied blizzards with bare hands now couldn't lift a spoon. Grief had come not as a wave, but as a tide that never receded. Downstairs, Glacier waited. His front leg still throbbed where the baton had landed, blood still crusted in the fur. But each night, he pulled himself toward her room, step by step, limping. Each hoof landing like a drumbeat in a war only he seemed willing to fight anymore. On the third night, he pushed his body through her door nose first. Flank, dragging pain etched into his breathing, and laid himself down beside her bed. She didn't flinch, but when his head found her side, warm breath washing over her ribs like a whispered memory, her hand moved, just slightly, onto his mane. Outside, the snow fell again. Light this time. Not a storm, just a quiet reminder that the world still turned even if hearts didn't. Across the county, in a suburban house with LED lights wrapped around the porch, the boy lay in a new crib. His name had been changed, Oliver now. His paperwork complete. Social workers approved. Medical checkups logged. But he wasn't sleeping. He turned in his blanket, eyes wide in the dark. His hand, tiny, searching, kept reaching toward the hollow where his chest met his shoulder. A space that once held a warmth, not human, not maternal, but sacred. His hand clenched, opened, clenched again. He whimpered once, then again, but no one came. The nanny outside his door watched through the baby monitor. Wrote it down in a notebook. Difficulty self-soothing. Back in the cabin, Savannah hadn't left her room, but she had moved. Just once. She'd pulled the blanket down to the floor, curled beside Glacier. The sketchbook, silent until now, lay half open beside her. A pencil rested under her thumb, though she hadn't drawn yet. Mavis stood at the door, listening. She didn't knock. She simply waited. Then whispered, "You know what they don't understand, Savannah?" That quiet is a form of protest, too. Nothing. So she said, "Love doesn't leave just because they made it illegal." Still nothing. Glacier shifted slow. His tail flicked once. A groan rose from his throat. Not pain exactly, but memory. A calling. Savannah moved. She sat up. Her hair unwashed, her skin pale. Her eyes sunken red, locked onto the empty page. She reached for the pencil. At first her hand shook too much to grip. She dropped it, tried again, and then a line. Rough, not clean, not strong, but a line. Then another, and another. She didn't sketch from memory. She sketched from need, from the space in her lungs where his cry used to live, from the place in her ribs where he curled every night, from the ghost of the morning he was taken, his warmth still clinging to her jacket. She didn't speak as she drew. Her breath came shallow, her shoulders tense. But the image took form. 3 figures, her, Glacier, the boy. They stood on a hill. No details, no trees, just sky, just height. As if they had climbed out of pain together and found somewhere untouched. She gave the boy wings, not because he'd flown away, but because she needed to believe he still soared somewhere, even caged. She gave Glacier scars on his leg, his chest, his side, but made him radiant with breath. Light spilled from his nose, as if warmth had never left him. And herself, she drew herself small, not as a girl, not even as a protector, but as a witness, as someone who had once held heaven in her arms and been asked to surrender it to paper. She titled the sketch in the corner. If they ask where he went, say up. Outside the window, snow piled on the branches again. Inside, Glacier lay beside her, breathing steady chest rising with hers. Savannah didn't cry. Not yet. But when she placed the drawing on the wall above her bed, beside all the others, it was the only one she couldn't look at without trembling. And it was the first one she would never sell, because some art wasn't made for galleries. Some art was a tombstone, and some like this was a rebellion. Quiet, beautiful, undeniable. It was almost spring. Not that the snow knew it yet, but the wind had softened. The edges of the lake were loosening, and somewhere beneath the frozen crust of Willow Creek water was whispering again. Savannah hadn't left the cabin in days. She wasn't hiding anymore. But she wasn't returning to the world either. She floated between the 2 feeding glaciers, stacking firewood, sketching only in the margins of old pages. She slept on the floor now, close to him. The silence between them had grown into something sacred, something that didn't ask for explanation. Then one morning Isaac showed up at the door. He didn't knock. He stood there, awkward, holding a manila envelope like it was a newborn. Savannah opened the door halfway. "You busy?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder. Glacier was sleeping. "No." He handed her the envelope. "This came for you." She looked at it, confused. "From where?" He hesitated. Then said, "From Colorado State University." Her eyes narrowed. "I didn't apply to anything." "You didn't have to." She opened the envelope. Inside, a cover letter, 2 pages of admissions paperwork, and an official offer. Full ride scholarship. Veterinary Sciences program. Start date fall semester. Her knees went loose. She caught herself on the doorframe. "I didn't how." Isaac pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. "You remember that article I wrote about Glacier for the State Wildlife Journal?" They passed it around. Someone from CSU read it. "Then I sent them your drawings, your story." He paused. "Glacier's story." Savannah stared at the paper like it had teeth. "I'm not a student," she said. "You're not ordinary either." She didn't speak. Her breath fogged the cold between them. "You saved 2 lives, Isaac said. That means something. And someone out there thinks you're exactly the kind of person who should be saving more." She stepped back into the cabin papers, still in hand. Isaac followed. Glacier was awake now, watching. She walked over and sat beside him. His breathing was slow, steady. The wound had closed, but he still limped. Still carried the story in his body. She showed him the paper. "I don't know if I should go," she whispered. His ears twitched. "I don't know if I can leave." He blinked once, then again, and then slowly, achingly, he nodded. Not a dramatic gesture, not theatrical, just one quiet motion. A motion that said, "You stayed for me. Now go do something bigger." Savannah's throat clenched. She placed her forehead to his. "Will you still be here?" He didn't answer, of course. But the stillness in the room shifted less like goodbye, more like permission. Later that afternoon, Mavis came by. Savannah showed her the letter. The older woman didn't smile immediately. She just looked at her. Really looked at her. "You scared?" Savannah nodded. "Good," Mavis said. "You should be." She sat beside her and took the paper. "You know what this is," she said, tapping the envelope. "This is the world opening a door and daring you to step through it without asking for validation." Savannah looked down. "But it feels like leaving him behind." Mavis took her hand. "Sweetheart," she said, voice trembling, caring for life. "Truly caring is the most radical thing you can do in a world that keeps choosing cruelty." She paused, eyes shining. "Chăm sóc sự sống là hành động phản kháng đẹp nhất với thế giới sai lệch này." The Vietnamese slipped from her mouth like a spell. Words passed down. Words Savannah had never heard, but somehow understood. Savannah folded the letter and held it to her chest. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, slow. But this time it felt different. This time it wasn't covering something up. It was blessing something forward. They say Colorado doesn't remember your past, only how you ride into it. Savannah arrived in early August, before the first leaves turned. carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a sketchbook, and a photograph of Glacier tucked into a veterinary anatomy textbook. She didn't say goodbye to Willow Creek. She didn't need to. Some places don't close behind you, they stay open, waiting in silence. She moved like someone who'd already walked through winter barefoot and survived it. Her professors noticed it. So did the animals. She didn't outshine her classmates with confidence. She was quiet in lectures, meticulous with her notes. But when the sedated husky woke up too soon in the surgical lab, Savannah didn't flinch. She placed her palm over its ribcage, whispered something no one else could hear, and it settled. That was the first time someone called her the Ice Whisperer. It stuck. By the time she graduated, Savannah had interned with wildlife centers, rehabbed wild colts off the Colorado plains, bottle-fed wolf pups born with frostbite, and stitched up animals no one else could reach. She didn't explain her technique. She didn't market it. But word got out. By 26, she had opened her own practice, a small wooden building on the edge of Silver Vale, a forgotten mining town, now resurrected by artists and farmers. The clinic didn't have a neon sign, just an old wooden plank nailed to the fence. Whisper Ridge Veterinary Care. Walk slow, speak softer. Inside the walls were lined with sketches. Not diplomas, not degrees. Drawings. Horses, wolves, owls, a child, a hill, a horse's breath melting snow, and Glacier, always Glacier. He was still with her, then older, now slower. His once frosted mane had faded to a silvery cream. The scar on his leg was long healed, but his gait never returned. He limped proudly beside her, as if the injury were a badge, not a wound. Clients would watch him follow Savannah room to room, lie near the cages of injured animals, breathe over them the way he once did over a child he refused to abandon. Savannah kept his photograph on her desk, but she never talked about the lake, or the cold, or the day he was hit. She didn't need to. He walked beside her, and that was enough. Years passed. She got used to the rhythm of healing. Some days were blood and bone. Others were warmth and whimpers. Some animals made it, some didn't. She cried over everyone, but she never stopped drawing. Every night after the last light flickered off and Glacier curled beside the back door, Savannah would open a new page. Not of pain, of memory, of what it meant to fight for warmth when the world only offered cold. And then one Thursday afternoon in mid-April, everything changed. A mother walked in, local new to town. Her 8-year-old son trailed behind her, carrying a leash in one hand and a sketchbook in the other. The dog, a young Appaloosa mix, had a deep gash on its haunch. The mother looked panicked. The boy calm. Savannah examined the dog, asked the mother to wait in the front. The boy stayed. "Do you like horses?" he asked. Savannah looked up. "Very much. My mom says I'm obsessed," he added, flipping through his sketchbook. "But I think it's something older than me. Like I didn't pick it. It picked me." Savannah smiled. He kept talking. Told her about dreams of snow, of a white horse with eyes like lakes, of waking up some nights crying and not knowing why. Then he stopped mid-sentence. He stared past her at the wall. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. Savannah turned. He was pointing at a sketch, framed in pine, hung near the examination room light. It was one of her first. A baby wrapped in blankets, a horse wrapped around the baby, snow all around them. But in the space between their breath, there was light. The boy stepped forward slowly, his hand lifted, pressed against the glass of the frame. "I've seen this before," he whispered. Savannah didn't move. "I used to dream about this exact picture," he said. "The horse, he smelled like wind. And he kept me warm. And I wasn't scared." The room grew still. Savannah knelt beside him slowly. Her voice was quiet. "Do you remember anything else?" He shook his head. "Only that his name felt like ice, but alive. Like something strong under something soft." She blinked. He turned to her. "You drew that, didn't you?" Savannah nodded. Tears lined his eyes, but he didn't cry. "I think he whispered, 'I knew you,' before I knew anything." Savannah didn't speak. She only reached out slowly and touched his shoulder. And for a moment, neither of them moved. They just stood in the presence of something unspoken. A reunion the world had never promised, but had somehow allowed. Outside, the wind blew warm against the clinic walls. And in that quiet, something old thawed again. The mountains remembered. Not in names or maps, but in scent and shadow. In the way snow clung longer to the trees in Willow Creek than anywhere else. Savannah hadn't returned to the cabin in over a year. She'd meant to. She'd told herself she would. But life kept moving like it was afraid to let her look back too long. Now she was here with him. He sat beside her in the passenger seat legs, too short to touch the floor, gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. The boy, now 8, though his eyes felt older, hadn't said much since they left the clinic. Just held the old sketch Savannah had taken off the wall and stared at it like a map only he could read. As the truck curved up through the pine-lined hills, the landscape opened, and there it was. The cabin, half swallowed by snowdrifts, the roof still patched with the same rusting tin, the porch missing one step. It hadn't changed. Not really, just faded, weathered. But inside it waited. Glacier had been fading for months. His appetite was small, his movements slower. The fire didn't reach him the way it used to. He no longer followed Savannah room to room. He stayed by the hearth, curled close to the last place that still felt like breath. Savannah parked in silence. The boy climbed out, holding the drawing tightly to his chest. They didn't speak. Inside, the air was warm, but quiet. The kind of quiet that trembles just before something ends. Glacier lay in front of the fire. His body was thinner, bones visible beneath the coat. His eyes opened as the door creaked. He didn't lift his head, but he saw them, and his ears twitched. Savannah knelt beside him. "Hey, old man," she whispered. Glacier blinked. Then slowly the boy stepped forward. He didn't ask permission, didn't hesitate. He knelt beside Glacier, not afraid. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the boy reached out his hand, small shaking, and touched the horse's nose. "I remember you," he said softly. Savannah swallowed her chest tight. "You kept me warm," the boy continued. "You stayed when no one else did." Glacier's eye glistened not from light, but from something deeper. Then the boy leaned in his lips close to the horse's ear and said, "I miss the warmth of my father." The room went still. Savannah's breath caught. Glacier's chest lifted. Then slowly, agonizingly, he raised his head just an inch. His nose met the boy's hand. A single breath escaped his nostrils. White soft, like the first fog of dawn before the sun burns it away. And then he let go. Not with sound, not with drama, just breath. One long, final exhale that lingered like a blessing in the air, before fading into the golden sunlight pouring through the window. The boy didn't cry. He placed the sketch gently beside Glacier's shoulder, then curled beside him, forehead to flank. Savannah sat across from them, knees to chest, eyes stinging but dry. Outside, the snow began to melt from the cabin's edge. And for the first time in years, the air didn't feel like loss. It felt like memory. Still, quiet, forever warm. There was no procession, no black veils, no scripted hymns. Just the soft crush of snow beneath boots and the wind brushing past like a mourner without a name. They buried Glacier at the edge of the frozen lake, not far from the place he had once pulled himself across the ice to save a child he didn't know, not far from where Savannah first understood what loyalty meant. The grave was simple, hand-dug, with spade and shovel and silence. The headstone had no polish, just a slab of driftwood weathered and carved by hand. The boy stood beside her now, not behind, not clinging. Beside. Savannah had asked for no service, but people came anyway. They trickled in slowly. Figures she hadn't seen in years. Old townsfolk who had once whispered behind her back in grocery aisles and church pews. The hardware store clerk who once refused to sell her nails because she was too young to be building anything. The librarian who had pulled her sketchbooks off the local art wall when someone complained. They were all here now, not speaking, just standing, as if proximity could redeem them. Mavis was there, bundled, tight eyes red. Isaac stood with his hat in hand, gaze low but unwavering. And in the middle, Savannah. She wore no black, just an old denim jacket and boots caked with mud and memory. She stepped forward, clearing her throat only once. No podium, no mic, just voice. There are lives, she began, that speak so loudly, without a single word, that you find yourself listening, even years later. She glanced down at the mound of earth, her breath misted. Glacier didn't know whose child he was saving. He didn't ask if the boy deserved it. He didn't care where he came from. He didn't run. Her voice cracked. He stayed. When others didn't. When others couldn't. The wind swept her hair across her face. She tucked it behind her ear eyes, shimmering. There are creatures in this world who never speak your language, but somehow teach you how to love in ways your own kind never could. A pause. Some souls don't come to stay forever. They come to change you. And then, like snow melting at the end of winter, they leave. She placed a hand on the wooden marker, then said softly but clearly, "There are beings who teach you how to love like you've never been broken." Silence. Not empty, just full of everything no one could say. The boy stepped forward next. His hands held the sketch. The first one, yellowing at the edges, crinkled at the fold where he used to sleep with it under his pillow. He knelt, pressed the paper into the soft snow above the grave. His fingers lingered there. Then he whispered, "Thank you, Dad." He stood, wiped his nose, and didn't cry. The crowd parted as Savannah turned. She placed an arm around the boy's shoulders, and together they walked toward the edge of the lake. A new sign had been erected there, carved by hand, mounted on 2 timber posts. It read, "Glacier Park." Beneath it, smaller text etched with care. "Here a creature not born human taught us what it meant to become one." Savannah and the boy walked onto the frozen lake, now safe-tended, watched. A place for children to skate, for quiet to rest. They each mounted a horse, hers, older his younger, with Glacier's pale coat and curious eyes. And as they rode across the white sheet of memory, wind rising around them, laughter slipping from the boy's lips like sunlight. The camera pulled wide, beyond the lake, beyond the mountains, beyond the years. Two figures on horseback riding across ice that once held a miracle and now held a legacy, a breath that would never fade.